So I have this habit where once I decide I want something, like once that thing is there's no stopping me. It's all I can think about. I become consumed by it, and it's game over. I will move mountains to make it happen.
Hey everyone, I'm Trent, a fabricator, designer, Okie, and Autodesker with 20 years of experience making things. Welcome to Shop Talk. Today, we're speaking with Mike Burroughs, founder of Stanceworks, fabricator, lifelong learner, YouTuber, and genuinely nice guy. Let's dive in. All right, Mike, thanks for joining. For anyone out there who may not know you, could you give us a little bit of who you are, where you're at, and what you're known for?
Absolutely. I appreciate you guys having me on. My name is Mike Burroughs from Stanceworks.com and the Stanceworks YouTube channel. And we're here in Orange County, California in the Stanceworks shop. And for those that aren't familiar with what I do, that's a great question. I'm not even sure how I describe my job these days, but something to the effect of, a constant documentation of building cars that I'm really passionate about.
Awesome. And I detect a little bit of a twang in your voice. Are you a Southern boy? Where are you from originally?
I am originally from Nashville, Tennessee.
Hey, there we go. Nashville. All right, cool. All right. So, like to kick it off, I've been an avid, watcher of Stanceworks since 2009. I actually remember 2009, 2010 is when I started bookmarking it. And I was like, oh, what is this? Like, this is such an interesting take on car culture, especially, when you look at just the overall aesthetic and the stance and the performance, right? At the time, I didn't really know of anybody doing that. And it's curious because I'm wondering if you got into car culture from a design, photography, storytelling aspect, or did you just always love car culture, wanted to be in it, and you just naturally said, hey, telling these stories is something that I'm actually good at and I want to document?
I think my own introduction into car culture is maybe a little bit different than most of my peers. It seems like everybody I know always has a story that reads something to the effect of, oh, I grew up, my dad was into cars, I helped him wrench on them, or my grandpa had this car and he, taught me how to work on cars, or things like that. And to be clear, both my dad and my stepfather are into cars. They're both car guys, but I didn't really grow up as a kid that was a car enthusiast. That wasn't a way that we all bonded. I got into cars once I started turning, 14 or maybe 15, and driving a car was on the horizon. And I think as every, 16-year-old of the early 2000s, I wanted a Honda Civic more than anything else on earth. That was it. Thank you, Fast and the Furious. And yeah, I think it just kind of naturally evolved from there. I became a BMW guy with my high school girlfriend's neighbor had an E30 coupe in his driveway. It was an M50 swapped car, and I saw it. I fell in love. It's been downhill ever since. And then kind of from there, wanting to go to different car shows, car events, document them, share the things that I thought were pretty cool. Stanceworks was born, and it was just a way to share what I was into, and it always kind of has been, in some sense or another. It's a way to share the things that I'm into.
Yeah, you hit on something kind of interesting right there because, you came to it from I think you mentioned swapping, right? Engine swapping BMWs. I mean, interesting swaps are kind of what you're known for, in my opinion, right? Like, you've got the Ferrari you're doing now. You have that old Model A that you did with a BMW engine. You have Rusty Slamington. Is that what it's called? Rusty, the old, yep. Yeah. So I don't know if that one has a swap in it, actually, now that I think about it. But, it's interesting because I think what you're talking about is looking at something that had tremendous amount of time, effort, and attention put into designing it, and then kind of thinking, I think I could do something different. I could do something maybe more interesting or outrageous or whatever it may be. Can you talk a little bit about like your process of when you start a project and say, like, the Ferrari is a good example, right? Like, Honda engine, turbo, 1,000 horsepower, in what would some say is one of the most beautiful cars ever designed. I would argue not necessarily like wonderfully fabricated in some instances, which is also a whole nother conversation. Yeah. So what's your process like when you look at a car? Like, do you just kind of say that'd be interesting and go for it and wing it, or is it more methodical? Like, are you actually looking at end use and
You know, so I have this habit where once I decide I want something, like once that thing is it is there's no stopping me. It's all I can think about. I become consumed by it and it's game over. I will move mountains to make it happen. And I think that's what yields each of the major projects that I've kind of built a name around for those that are familiar with those projects. And it starts as kind of this idea, and then once something in my head clicks and I say, yeah, that's what I want to build, then there's just no stopping it. The train leaves the station, you got to be on board or you're getting left behind. As far as how those ideas come about, I mean, for the Ferrari, there is a little bit of backstory to my desire to own a 308. My stepfather, who just passed away a few weeks ago, introduced me to the 308. When I was in high school, I think, or maybe early college, he was pointing out, man, look at these Ferraris. He knew them from Magnum PI, and he said, man, you can get these cars for 20 grand right now. And, for a family, like, we never ever had a new car, so any $20,000 car is an expensive car, but hey, this was a Ferrari. It was an opportunity to do something really cool, and so my stepdad started looking and saying, hey, what if I did this? And when I saw that car, it was very much that moment of, oh, that car is beautiful. That's one of the most beautiful cars I've ever seen. And I latched onto it, and I even tried to find one to buy for myself. I considered selling my 3 Series that I had that was kind of one of the first cars I built a name around. It's actually the one that's right here behind me. I had a guy who wanted to buy it for way more money than any of them were selling for at the time. He was willing to give me 25 grand for this thing because it was one of the very first S54 swapped cars. And with that 25, I'd have been able to have a Ferrari in college. I thought this would be incredible, but I couldn't part ways with it. I've now had it for 18 years. It wasn't an option. And I got really lucky with some of the cars that I've bought and the way that they've gone crazy in this whole bubble that everything has been going through. I had a Land Cruiser that exploded in value, and then I took all of the money I got from that, and I went and chased one of my first dream cars, a Hummer H1, and I bought the cheapest one that I could find, and I got really lucky. It was a solid truck. I flipped that for way more, and I had enough to buy this Ferrari. It was like every penny I had, but I was like, hey, I can do this now or I'm never going to get to. And so I went for it, and I knew before I ever actually bought the car exactly what I wanted to do with it. I knew from the get-go, this old V8, it's got to go. I got to get rid of this thing. I want to pick a lightweight power plant. I want to pick something that's reliable, that has a huge power ceiling, a huge aftermarket to it, and has, let's call it a solved engine, right? People race with these motors at racetracks all across the US every weekend, all across the world even. Any problem that I'm going to come into, that I'm going to encounter, has already been figured out. There's no unknowns about this engine. Any weird issue that I want to type into Google, someone out there has encountered it. So between all of those, the K-Series was the most logical engine that I could put in there. And I think a lot of people look at it as maybe an engine choice I went with just to upset people. But that's the furthest thing from the truth. This is a logical way to approach the problem in the car that I want to build.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of stuff in there to unpack too, right? Like, one, like, purists are always going to hate, right? There's always going to be someone who says that you did it wrong. But the interesting thing for me is this, kind of lifestyle choice I think a lot of fabricators, designers, and engineers have, which is relentless pursuit, right? Like, you come up with an idea and you don't stop until you achieve the goal. I find that super fascinating because more often than not, it requires one to learn a whole lot of new skills, potentially acquire new types of equipment, or, whatever, right? You're on a fact-finding mission, and your whole goal is to enable yourself to get to that final kind of sense of achievement.
Yeah, I think every project, I try to look at it as an opportunity to learn something new. So if we work backwards, the Ferrari for me was an opportunity to learn how to TIG weld. that was something that was daunting for me beforehand. I had tried it, and pretty much all I had accomplished is sticking tungsten into metal over and over and over again. Just grinding down full sticks of tungsten until there was nothing left, and then on to the next one. And I kind of realized if I don't just commit to learning this and tell myself, hey, you can't touch the MIG welder until this project's done, I'm never going to put in the immense amount of effort that it takes to learn it. And so that's what I told myself at the beginning of the project. You're only going to touch a TIG welder on this car, and you will know how to do it by the end of it. And if you look at the car and you know where I started versus some of the last things I did, you can see that journey through the whole thing. There are some beautiful welds in the car, relatively speaking, and there are some awful welds by any regard. But, you know, I can at least take pride in what that journey represents and how it's, you know, immortalized in that car. Projects before that, you know, when I wanted to build Rusty, which was this tube chassis mid-engined E28 BMW, I didn't even know how to do tube work, or I didn't even know how to fabricate. And so I, for starters, said, well, I need to learn how to do this stuff. I'm going to build a hot rod. And so I bought a 28 Ford Model A that was just a kind of rickety taken apart body with the roof. It had been cut off and discarded. I bought this thing on Craigslist and said, I'm going to build my own chassis. I'm going to learn how to, I'm going to mount an axle to it. I'm going to, you know, just build this whole thing from the ground up, learn some way or another. All in an effort so that I'd know how to build the next car, so I'd know how to build Rusty. And it just kind of carries forth. Now that the Ferrari is, you know, let's call it done in some respect. It's always going to be a work in progress. But now that the big part of that fabrication journey is over, I'm already looking forward, and to be totally transparent, I'm already fixated on what this next project is. I think I know what it's going to be. I'm trying so hard to bring it to fruition, and everything I've learned so far will allow me to build that car. So every project represents a stepping stone to the next one. You know, learning how to incorporate new technologies into it. For example, utilizing CAD design on the Ferrari, from everything from like small brackets and tabs to designing my front suspension geometry, my rear suspension geometry. Knowing now that for the next project, I can take all of that stuff that I've learned, or even on the Audi that I'm working on now, I bought a 3D scanner. I want to learn how to take that information and design, I don't even know the terminology for it, but, you know, organic shaped parts as opposed to just the simple sheet metal stuff that I currently know how to do. It's always a step forward in learning how to do more and more and more and building that skill set. I think that's probably the biggest challenge of any of the projects, kind of to answer the question in the longest way possible. But every other aspect to the projects, I think everybody's familiar with. I mean, any guy is going to say, oh, it's, you know, from the financial side of it, it's always tough. What money can you scrounge up here? What, you know, can you find a cheap car here, flip it there, you pull some money here, sell off this, sell your spare parts, you know, so on and so forth, and just put everything into the car. Or honestly, the time and the motivation aspect. People ask me all the time, how do you stay motivated on a project? How do you walk back out into the shop after you haven't touched something for a month and convince yourself to do it? And that's probably the hardest part of any build. And my answer is always the same, is the only way to do it is to just force yourself to get back out there, pick up the tools and work.
Okay, so this is a shop talk, so we have to talk about your shop. Tell us where you are, how you got there, and maybe something about one of the cars in your background.
Okay, so the shop is in Costa Mesa, California. As far as how I wound up in Costa Mesa, there's kind of a weird backstory there it's for a different time. A former business partner of mine basically plucked this one out of a hat, and I was along for the ride. I said, all right, do what you want. I had two partners at the time, and they both moved out to California before I did. They rented our first shop space, which was right across the street, and they said, all right, here's where we're at. You moving out? And I said, okay, I'll be right there. So I've been in Costa Mesa the entire time since November of 11, and at this point, it feels like home. I have been in this particular building now for since November Is that right? No, March of 13. So a little over 10 years now. And it's slowly shaped into, I guess, being something of my own. It's definitely my own mess. I don't know how messy it looks on camera. It's a disaster. It always is. I like to pretend that, oh, it's messy because I've been thrashing, but no, it's always a disaster. But it's my disaster. It's my space. It's my creative space, and I love it. I love it here. It just sucks that it's so expensive. That's the drawback. And then, yeah, as far as the cars behind me right now, so above my head is my E36. It's one of my first project cars I ever had. Not the first car I ever had, but pretty close to it. I've had it since I was 17, and I could never sell it. I hate calling cars a forever car, but you'd have to pry this one, out of my cold, dead hands. I just from a moral perspective, I'd feel awful if I sold it at this point. So it's kind of along for the ride, or in this case, along to be sitting here collecting dust, and it needs a bunch of stuff, as projects tend to need. Just off camera, we've got my 31 Ford Model A. That's kind of on the short list of cars I need to get put together and sold so that I can fund whatever this project that's going to come up next is, kind of whatever I find once I got money burning a hole in my pocket. We've got behind me the white 535 E28s are kind of my favorite all-around car, excluding things that I can't afford. The Ferrari back there is not mine. Everybody always says, oh, you got a second one? No, that's a buddy's car. And then we've got an Audi project on the other side of me. It's an Audi Quattro. It's kind of the current big project, small in contrast to the Ferrari that everybody's been following along with. But it's, I guess, big compared to, your average car guy, because we're tearing it all the way apart and replacing the entire driveline with one that is way more powerful than it needs to be, and will do, 500-600 horsepower all-wheel drive launches. So
That's awesome. And it's one that I'm eagerly awaiting more videos on YouTube for, personally. So that's great.
Yeah, fingers crossed we'll have some good progress on it pretty soon. The engine's in pieces, hopefully going together within the next couple weeks, and pedal down once we come back from Australia. At the end of the month, we're heading to Australia. The Ferrari is not here, for people that are familiar with it. It was on a boat. It just arrived on Australian shores the other day. We've sent it out there for the World TimeAttack Challenge. And so I'll be flying out there to drive it, and I'll have a blast. I'll embarrass myself. It'll be a good time for everybody involved.
I'm curious, what do you think new technology in the next couple years is going to allow you to do in your practice?
That's a good question and a tough one to answer. It's so hard to kind of see into the future and know what's going to be there and what's going to kind of trickle down. I think the immediate answer to that is the access to 3D scanning. When this technology popped up, I guess let's say when I first saw it only a handful of years ago, and you'd look up how much does this machine cost, and let's say 5, 6, 7 years ago, it was a $100,000 machine. And even only maybe 3 or 4 years ago, it was a $30,000 to $50,000 machine, down to $1,000, down to a few $100s, or even on your phone. The level of access to what you can do with that is seemingly unlimited. And then when you pair that with, I recently bought my first 3D printer. I really waited until I could buy a 3D printer that would work directly out of the box. I didn't want to deal with the setup and the leveling and all the headaches that I kind of read about, the tinkering with the machine. I'm not really trying to make a new hobby for myself. I just want a tool that I can use to implement my current skill set with. How can I take all these cool CAD parts and pieces that I've learned how to draw and can, because I'll sit on my computer in the evening and just make parts in Fusion or what have you and just have fun making things. How can I bring those to real life in an effective way without some huge time sinker, having to learn some massive skill set that's going to take months? And the 3D printer I bought allowed me to do that right out of the gate. I mean, I plugged it in, I set it up, and I had beautiful parts coming out immediately. And the fact that anybody can hop online, I've told several friends about it, hey, go buy this machine, and it shows up and you can do this too, is incredible. And I think that if I had to guess, I'm probably not too far away from getting to take that and getting an at-home or here in the shop CNC machine where I can start making billet parts. I think that's my dream. I think every, I'm not going to call myself a machinist. I'm very far from it. But every fabricator at least would love to be able to, make, let's say, billet engine mounts or design your own valve cover or any of those types of things. That's what I would love to do. And I know that I have the software side at my hand, in my fingertips. So when will I be able to have the machine for a reasonable price? And there are some out there that are getting pretty cheap. And then the integration, right? You always have the trouble of having one piece of software talk to the other. But if that part gets bridged where I don't have to learn how to write my own G code, like the people that came before me, let them walk so I can run here. Once that's figured out and I can just have a machine show up, I can plug in and on my software, just like with the 3D printer, just hit, hey, import this model and make it reality. I have to imagine we're pretty close to that. And that's one of the things I'm most excited about, because that seems just limitless in terms of what you could make and how far I'd be able to take my projects, the quality of the projects, the speed at which I can get them done. It just seems like it would be a snowball effect towards creating things that I could only imagine in years past.
Yeah. Well, I think the cool thing about it is we're already there. Like, Autodesk has a ton of partnerships. We work with a lot of the big machine tool manufacturers, and most of us who work, at least in the design and manufacturing sector, have some fabrication background, right? Like I have a CNC machine. I have a, traditional Bridgeport. I use both of them. I use technology to bridge the gap. And, I think the interesting part about that is the hope to get there. I think a lot of it is just an awareness issue. Like, so we work with Haas. They're a wonderful partner of ours. They're shipping machines out the door, by the tens of thousands a month. Like, I'm not exactly sure what their numbers are, but like, it's surprising how many CNC machines are sold new every year. I used to run this shop, and another one of our partners, Datron, has this machine called a Datron Neo, and it looks like an old video game cabinet where, it's smaller than a Coke machine. And it's got basically a giant iPad interface. And I was giving a tour to some kids for this STEM project. And, I love when kids get in the shop because they're always like blown away by the size and scale of some of these machines. And then out of the corner of my eye, I see this kid walking up to this Datron Neo. It's a really expensive machine, like $150,000, the size of like like a video game cabinet. And I was like, oh, they're fine. They can walk up to it and look at it. And then all of a sudden I see him start figuring out the interface because it's touchscreen and so intuitive, and they're at home all day playing their games on their iPad. And I think what's interesting to me is that barrier to entry, like you talked about writing G code by hand so that you could run, a lot of it is just getting seat time and in front of it and learning the interface. The other part is making the actual methodologies intelligent enough to where you can have some intuitiveness come from it, right? Like, I want that to be a hole. There's 5 different ways to machine a hole, right? Only one of them works best for your application. And I think like companies like Haas and Datron and some of our partners like Cloud NC, they're working on that. Like, I have a 3D model that I scanned, that I edited or amended or re-engineered. I want to make it, and they can use generative AI languages to actually say, like, here is 90% of the programming that you need to do to get there. And it's interesting because I think it goes back to that purist thing where people might be mad that you used you K-swapped a Ferrari versus whatever. Like, one, I think a couple things happen. People don't want what they love and what they do to be like diminished by the fact that it might get easier, because you learn the hard way and you take a lot of pride in that. But at the same time, it opens up so many new realms for people to get into an interesting field that they could actually become super, in love with and become a really talented machinist or whatever. So I think, like, to your point about getting in with 3D modeling, getting in with scanning, that's a great start. I'd also say that in the next like 12 to 18 months, I think companies are going to ship CNC machines that will have intuitive interfaces for someone who doesn't have any experience to put it in their shop and kind of work through it. And I'd argue that the automotive sector was one of the early adopters of this with CNC plasma. I mean, when you're taking 2-dimensional CAD files, you're, saying, hey, I want to cut here, I want to do that, I want these to be holes. And, people figured that out pretty fast. Now all you have to do is add another dimension, right? 2D to 3D, and in some cases, two more axes for 5-axis work. So, and then if you ever need any help, just give me a call. I'm happy to help you stumble through it. I love this stuff. So on that thread, there's a lot of like tech that goes into building cars these days. Like I follow this fella, Matt, who I don't know if I'm saying it right. And if you're listening to this or watching this, I apologize for butchering your name, but like, I think used to work at Kibby Tech, who.
Yeah, it's like Matt 826 or
Something like that. Yeah.
I butchered it, but I follow him. His work is amazing. Every time he posts, it's like, that's the inspiration right there. It's like, man, look at those sick billet parts coming out of that machine. I can do the design portion of it, maybe not as well, but I can draw something up. Now I just got to figure out how to do that part.
I'm telling you, I've seen some phenomenally machined parts, and every time that dude posts something, I'm like, oh yeah, that's good. Like, give me more of that. It's M26 Engineering. So a little bit of a shout out to him. I believe he's also one of our customers, which makes me even more stoked, because it's like, I like being able to see people just doing really cool things. But then when you realize that they're doing it, like, I would imagine it's like if anyone ever bought a race car from you and you see them out at the track and they're just nailing it, part of it's them being a driver, but the other part is them having a really good piece of equipment. And so I don't know. I like following him. I love what Kibby Tech does too. I mean, they're making some really, really cool cars, and the people who are pinning those things or designing those things or doing all the, clay modeling in the actual design shops, they're people too. Right. They have social media accounts. They watch television. They listen to music. They draw inspirations from all kinds of things. No one just automatically snaps their fingers and says, look at me, I've just created something wholly unique. I would argue that till I'm blue in the face. Right. Like, even the greatest innovations of our time have drawn off of other things. I think what's interesting is that, like, now more than ever, technology plays a role in that, whether it be the world is a smaller place, we're all connected. I mean, we're having a conversation and we're 700 miles apart, and there's also like this accessibility in capabilities now that I'm seeing more than ever, because some of those folks get to drive the price of historically really expensive tech down enough to where you can have access to it. 3D scanning, perfect example, been around since the 90s, not affordable for 25, 30 years. And then so many people use it. They sell so many machines, tech gets easier, whole supply chain changes. And now you have one in your shop and you're able to take things to a new level. I would actually argue that, metal additive is a perfect example of that. You've got HP, you've got, Stratasys, you've got all of these different companies making industrial equipment that are now been used long enough and in practice long enough, and the material science is advanced enough that you could go out in the next couple of years. In fact, you can go out today and buy a metal additive 3D printer of the same type of industrial application that used to be $500,000, right? Like, so I think technology, we need the big OEMs, we need the big companies to invest in it to help advance it, because they're the ones who can actually put the energy and the effort into understanding it better. But I also think there's an agility in being a smaller startup or a small business or an individual person in your shop in the middle of Canada or wherever, who happens to say, you know what, I really want to look at 3D printing as a way to make, stamping dies for my sheet metal work, right? And then all of a sudden it gets on the internet and you're out there doing it. So what do you think the role of technology, at least from an automotive design capability in schools or fabrication, plays a role in the future? Like, what would you hope to see? I mean, you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, so my high school, we didn't have any like real Votech type stuff, but we did have, weirdly enough, and it must have been a remnant from some old program the school had, but we did have an auto body shop. And so it was specifically paint and body work. There wasn't any fabrication or how to work on cars or anything like that. And it was disappointing because it was clearly where most of the, I guess, teachers wound up sticking the kids that would misbehave or that just didn't want to be in class. And so let's say maybe there's 30 kids out in that class. there were 3 or 4 of us that wanted to be there. This was some way for me to learn something automotive while I'm at school. And so while the rest of the class just didn't pay any attention to it and didn't learn anything and, just who knows what, there were a few of us that were there and really put every ounce of effort we could into learning a craft. And I haven't touched a paint gun since high school. That's not my thing. If I could never do body work again, I'd be happy. But I still value what I got out of that course. And I guess to that end, I have to admit I don't look very often, but it feels like, from a far away perspective, it seems like those programs are disappearing from schools a lot of the times. And I would love to see that kind of come back, and for more emphasis to be placed on what these kids can learn from these programs that is widely applicable. I mean, let's use CAD software, Fusion 360, as an example. If there was a class that taught that through, let's say, an automotive setting, because I can tell you now, there's a ton of friends of mine in high school. We were all obsessed with cars. We would have paid attention to anything that had to do with cars. If we were learning software under the guise of automotive design and cool stuff, but then we learned that and we had an applicable skill to then go out into the world and use, and whether that's get an engineering degree or go start working at a company or any of those types of things, I can't imagine how powerful and how much opportunity there would be there, given that it's so accessible now. Kind of back to your point of all these tools, all these different resources, they are truly accessible. Kids can get their hands on them. In your case, talking about a kid walking right up to a CNC machine and punching buttons on it and making it come to life because there's an innate understanding of how it works. Trickles all the way down to the software. They know how to use it, et cetera, et cetera. So hopefully there's an answer in there somewhere of, I feel like there's huge opportunities, whether it's under the guise of automotive excitement or automotive industry or anything else, to learn some incredible skills, and then to also tell these students, like, hey, you can take these skills and go do amazing things. You don't even necessarily have to go to college. I dropped out of college and I kind of grew up in what felt like a community that insisted if I didn't go to college, I was never going to make it. You have to do that. And my parents even told me, no, you're going to college, end of story.
That's that Midwest life. That's that Midwest life. I grew up in the same way, like go to college. So I hear you on that one.
Yeah, and when I finally came to the table, I remember I told my parents, hey, we got to sit down at the kitchen table. I want to talk to you guys. And I was scared to death when I told them I wanted to drop out of college and go pursue this Stanceworks thing full time. I want to move to California where the automotive aftermarket is, and I want to give this a real shot. And I thought there was I figured they'd say over our dead bodies, there's no chance. Nah, you've got 1.5 years left. You have to finish. And to my surprise, they said, no, we think it's a great idea. You should do it. That's cool. And so I'm lucky in that respect. But looking back on it, I wish that there had been more acknowledgement about what opportunities exist out there with things like the trades and, just where you can take these skill sets that you can learn, what kind of money and what kind of life you can go out there and make, even just as a welder, for example. I mean, a fabricator. If I had known that I could get into fabrication earlier than I did, if that hadn't been kind of shrouded in this, you need to go to college so you can be better than just being a welder type of thing, I like to imagine where could I be now if I had that opportunity in school, if I could have been sticking metal to metal and had access to these tools and these things to further all these sources of inspiration that I have. So I'm all for it. I want to get these kids using this stuff bottom to top.
Yeah, I totally agree. I went to college pretty late in life, actually. I started out, ran a horse ranch in Texas, did all kinds of weird odd jobs, right? Just like got experience, and then finally came to the conclusion, I want to go to college. And then I looked at, industrial design because I wanted to work in cars. I wanted to do all that stuff. My school didn't have an industrial design program, so I went to school to be an architect. And then in architecture school, to your point, I had a couple professors who were just kind of like, hey, you should really use this experience you've had before college to inform your process. And, coming from welding and fabrication and all these, I got super into advanced manufacturing and robotics and CNC and all of that stuff. And I think you're right. I would love to see education put more of an emphasis on kids pursuing what they're passionate about and understanding that technology isn't just the latest generative AI conversation, right? It's not the latest hot topic. I mean, there's so many kids doing phenomenal stuff like in FIRST Robotics or even those like BattleBots things. When you get a bunch of kids making like killer robots, I mean, how rad is that? And I'm really excited to see where those kids end up and what they end up doing, because I truly believe that a lot of those are the advancements in tech that we all want to happen. It's going to come from that generation because they grew up with it. Like I remember a time when the hottest tech was a Game Boy. You know what I mean? Like they're growing up with iPads, generative AI, connected data across the world. So I think it's pretty fascinating. For you and your work, what's kind of the next thing you're going to learn to put into your process? Like, you hit on 3D printing, but going further than that and going further than CNC, like what do you think technology is going to enable you to do in your cars? Is it to make them go faster? Is it, lighter? Like what's on your mind?
So I have two answers for that one. And the first one is I'm looking at the direction that cars are going, and I know that there is this massive shift to EV. And I think EV scares a lot of car guys. They find it very threatening, or they find it to be, let's just go with existentially threatening to what they find romantic about cars as a whole, whether it's the sounds, the smells, the raw, visceral experience that an internal combustion engine offers. And I really understand those things because all of those resonate with me very heavily. But I try to tell people, hey, if you could look at this very objectively and stand back and strip away your passion for cars, if you think back to like the earliest cars, whether it's I think some of the really early stuff was Benz and Daimler, or maybe let's go all the way back to a Ford Model T. I mean, everyone knows a Model T. I doubt anybody thought that a Model T sounded cool or associated that sound with automotive passion. That had to come once the excitement happened, right? The first automobile race happened once the second automobile arrived. And then it was through that race, and then the seek to beat the other guy and to make their cars faster and better. And then that's the kind of the genesis of where all that romance begins. When you fire up any of these cars behind me and you hear the way they sound or the way they smell, the smell of fuel isn't like objectively good. We associate it with things. And so I try to remind people like, hey, at some point you're going to associate that wild electric scream of thousands of volts going off at once that you can't hear somewhere else other than in an electric car, and you're going to think about the way that that's the fastest thing you can strap yourself into. You're going to feel G-forces you've never felt before, so on and so forth. Like there will be a romance that forms around those things if you let it happen. And I understand people that say, I'm not going to let that happen. I don't want to be a part of that, and that's fine. And I'm not even saying I think it should replace everything else, but I'm trying to be open to what is an inevitability. So I'm not afraid at all of why. I mean, I've built complete wiring harnesses for cars. I've wired cars from the ground up. So I know 12-volt systems really, really well. So I think there's going to be a time that's going to come where I want to learn at least how to do the electric stuff. I don't know if I'll ever build an electric car. I'm more interested in internal combustion. But then again, like I said, if I don't allow myself to fall in love with this other stuff, then am I doing a disservice to myself? That train's going to leave the station. I should be on board of it. So I think I want to at least dabble in the EV thing. I don't even know if it's the permanent next step. I think there's a lot of opportunity with hydrogen-powered cars and whatnot. And then on the flip side, to go totally the other direction, the one that scares me, the one that I feel like I'm missing out on, is the ability to code. You're talking about how these young kids can do all sorts of crazy stuff. Kids in school, grade school now, are learning how to write full-on codes and apps. And I'm talking to some of these guys on the Stanceworks Discord channel earlier, and they're saying, yeah, I wanted to run this gauge cluster in my car, so I built a Raspberry Pi and an Arduino and coded up this and that. And to me, it's like, not only is that like completely foreign, it's scary to me. I don't even know where to begin with that. And I feel like I missed out on learning because I feel like I'd have to go to school for that. And of course you don't. I could learn that here just like I could learn anything else. But it's daunting. And I feel like at some point I need to convince myself to open that up and try the basics. Even just if I am going to learn the smallest tidbit of it so that I can understand it, so I can wrap my head around it, or at least know kind of the fundamentals of what's going on. So I could tell somebody else maybe what I want, or so I know how to ask somebody else for help instead of just saying, hey, I have this idea. Can you code it for me? Could you make this happen? Which is where I'd be at right now if I wanted to do something that required that. And so, I think coding is kind of that next frontier. It really seems, it is a language, right? It's many languages, but it seems like it would unlock so many opportunities it seems kind of limitless in the same way that design and additive manufacturing are limitless in what you could make. The sky's the limit. Imagine it and you could pretty much make it happen. Coding goes even beyond that. You could make your own entire operating system for your car, or your own fuel management, or anything. So that's kind of the other side of it's daunting to me. I'm scared of it. I don't know anything about it. I don't know anything about coding whatsoever, not even the bare basics. I think I know how to put an image link in HTML thanks to MySpace. That's about it.
Deep cut.
Those will be the two.
You're totally, I think you're spot on. When I look at like Extreme E, like the kind of like Dakar style electric trucks they're doing now, like I'm blown away from an engineering perspective. But then when you start talking about coding in comparison to that, the truth is that code is the language of the future. If you write a piece of good code, you can have impact across the world. To be able to understand how to do that, especially in the aftermarket automotive industry. When electric cars, when you start talking about tuning, today you're plugging in a computer, you're looking at like the fuel map sensor, you're like, the torque curves and the horsepower curves, you're taking it to a dyno, all those things. In the future, you're going to have to be able to code in Python or, something like that to be able to say, give me more torque off the line, or throttle response go from, 0.01 seconds to 0.001 seconds for whatever. I agree. That's an area where I'm super weak. Like when it comes to coding, I can stumble through some of the most basic of code, but I'm always blown away by some of these kids being able to just do that and say, oh yeah, you just do this and that, and then it does that. And I'm like, no, back up. Explain it to me like I'm a 2-year-old, please, because I really don't know what's going on here. Like on that note, when you talk about EV, when you talk about the future of the industry and all this technology, like moonshot, like what's a car you want to build if capabilities, finances, and time weren't an issue? Like literal pocket full of money, had every skill you needed to do, and the car that you wanted to build actually still existed and could be purchased, because I know that that's a problem sometimes.
That's the big one. My favorite car, period, is the BMW M1 Pro car, which for the people that aren't BMW fans out there, it is a mid-engined halo car BMW made starting in the very late 70s. They were only made for a couple years. The Pro car is a version of this car. It's a factory race car. These cars were raced as kind of a feeder series to Formula One back in the 80s. And so it was a one-make race. You'd have 20 of these cars screaming around the track. They're 80s wedge-shaped exotic cars, so it's like exactly what I'm into. The shapes are amazing. Instead of having a V12 in them, they have this wicked inline six. They sound incredible. The engine that's in those cars is exactly what the engine in Rusty was modeled after, so that I could have some pedigree of that in my own car, so on and so forth. That would be if I could have any car on earth, that would be it. I'm about $1 million short of affording one, so that's going to be problem number one. And then when it comes to building one, there's just so many hurdles in terms of how do you even begin that process. So I don't know. That's always kind of like the, hey, if I won the lottery tomorrow, that's what I would go do. What would I do with it? I couldn't even. I don't even know. I'd be on cloud nine, right? In terms of kind of what are some other projects that I've been rattling around with in my head, and how do I want to accomplish them with everything that I've learned so far? What's that next step going to be? I've built a tube chassis before. Rusty had a tube chassis. I would really love to go build another one now that I've progressed so far as a fabricator. So I think the next project is almost certainly going to be a complete tube chassis, design it from the ground up. I'll take a car, I'll skin it, and then just build everything inside to my own spec and taste, and, just build something crazy. It'll be a race car because tube chassis car isn't suited for the street. And so there's a handful of cars that I'm looking to for inspiration. One of them right now, kind of the first exotic that I fell in love with, was the, I think it's a X180 or S4 Lotus Esprit. So like starting very late 80s up into, I think they made them into like the early 2000s. That was like the first car I fell in love with. It was an exotic thanks to Sega GT. Old school video game, deep cut there. And I've wanted one ever since. I think it'd be really cool to you can find them for relatively cheap given the car's pedigree. I mean, like the V8 ones in great shape are now going for 200 grand, but you can find a 4-cylinder beat up one that needs a lot of repair work for 20 grand. Which, make no mistake, that's still a huge chunk of money, but I'll sell something and try to put some cash towards it. And then get rid of that 4-cylinder, probably bring in, I really want to use the BMW V8, the S65 from the E92 M3. It's a naturally aspirated V8 that just revs to the moon, makes incredible sounds. Incorporate that, redesign suspension, make the whole thing work. If it's going to be a tube chassis and I have a 3D scanner, now I have the opportunity to scan the inside of the body once I strip it and design a chassis in CAD. That's something, every bit of tube work, I've built a lot of roll cages and stuff, never done it through CAD. It's always just been good old classic tube protractor, tape, marks, pen, paper, do some math. Getting to design it all and know ahead of time exactly where the project is going to be, and being able to incorporate designing every mount, every bracket, every chassis brace, call upon my friends at Send Cut Send, get them involved to, again, take what I'm capable of making up to that next level using plasma and laser cutting to have everything turn out perfect. Build a perfect example, or the best example that I can conjure up, and just take all my skill sets that I've learned so far to that next level. Push everything further and further. How fun, how crazy of a car can I make? How far can I take this vision that I have in my head? And then how nice can I make it? I always try to remind myself and my audience, don't let perfection become the enemy of good enough. That will kill your project. It'll kill your own motivation. You'll never finish. You have to know where that line is. But if you have the excitement and the motivation, you can keep pushing that line further and further forward, closer and closer to perfection, to build the best car you can. And so I think all of this boils down to whatever that next project is, it's an effort to push that line further and further and build better and better cars that do car things better and better, whatever it's meant to be, whether it's going to go out and drift or go around a track, or maybe someday I'll build a drag car, or who knows what. I'd love to build something that's like an Ultra 4 truck that can go out and jump. That's like the most hardcore version of anything you can build. Maybe I'll do something like that. I don't know what it'll be yet, but it'll be something.
That's amazing. Yeah, and I think I love that answer. You are a fan of the wedge cars. Like the two examples you gave, I'm like, oh, big time. Mine would probably be wedges. Yeah, they're both wedge cars. I was like, oh, that makes sense. I think I oddly think about this stuff a lot, and I want to get to that part about like connecting things. So I guess I had like two thoughts. One, like Send Cut Send, amazing service. Like this idea. So I'm a happy customer of theirs. I'm not getting any money to say this out loud, but like check them out. They're amazing. The ability to connect systems or capabilities or whatever is one of the reasons why I love my industry so much, right? Like when we talk about Fusion, it's one of those deals where it's like, it's a democratizing tool. Because everything you just said, I imagine that you're going to have this hybrid process where it's going to be a little bit of handwork in your shop, drawing it on a piece of paper. But to your point, you're going to put it in CAD. But then having the opportunity to actually just like get in there and look at stress analyses, right? If you're doing a tube chassis and you're going to do your suspension components, you need to understand if those knuckles or if those brackets are going to hold. When you talk about doing those things and when you talk about CAD, like how far do you want to go in that CAD journey? Like when you build this tube chassis, do you envision you'll be doing simulation and additive build and all of that stuff? Or, is the next kind of tier of your journey diving more into the fabrication side with, subtractive manufacturing, machining, things like that? Like how do you envision using the digital tool in your toolbox next to help you achieve that build?
Well, so I think there's two facets to look at that I want to lean more on CAD design to help. So first, this is silly to say, as a fabricator, I hate cutting metal and I hate drilling holes. Those two things, if I never had to cut metal again, if I never had to drill another hole, I'd be a happy man. I can't stand them. So one, I'm going to do everything I can to just eliminate that. And then
this is why, by the way, this is why Send Cut Send is so brilliant. Because they can cut all of my parts for me and I can just weld. You know what I mean? Like, yep. Anyway, I totally agree. I totally hear you. Sorry to cut you off, but like,
no,
yes,
it's totally fine.
I hate it.
I love sitting down at the workbench to weld. And it's kind of to touch upon that, I hated the process of MIG welding. I always felt like a little bit like I was along for the ride. And there are guys that I know that can MIG weld like crazy. I have no idea how they do it. For me, I'm proficient with it, but there was always that chance that I would like lift the hood up, even if I felt like I was killing it. And you lift the hood up and you're like, what the heck went wrong here? Well, how did that happen? What's going on? Or maybe it just didn't kind of quite come out right. Or you get, who knows, problems here and there. And so there was always a stress associated with once it came time to lower that hood, especially if it was like, hey, this is do or die. This is a chassis tube that's in place. It's in there. You got to make it look good, right? And then you're doing it upside down and maybe a piece of slag starts to come down and you're just like, ugh, what do I do about this? I don't want to grind this all out. My transition to TIG welding changed that radically. It's my favorite part of the process now. I look forward to like, oh, today's a welding day. Aside from how hot it's going to be, I love sitting there. I can see every mistake that I make. I can feel it as it happens. I can wrap my head around what's going on. The process makes more sense. I'm more in control of it, so on and so forth. How do I make more of the car building experience like that, where every bit of it feels like that magic that welding feels like? Or when you design a part and let's say I use CAD a lot to make a template and I'll print it out on paper, I'll stick it to my material, and boom, now I've got a drilling template, now I've got a folding template, and I can clean the whole thing up on my disc sander, and I've got a nice finished part that looks like somebody with way more talent than I have made it. That's using CAD to my own advantage. Those parts of the process I really enjoy. I love making. I love transforming nothing into something. How do I eliminate the parts of this that I dislike? The other side of it would be introducing new tools and workflow based on the skills that I currently have. So whether that's subtractive manufacturing, making my own billet parts. Like, there's a huge difference between having a folded sheet metal motor mount arm and some awesome billet arm. I want the billet one. One, I can make it stronger and lighter. And two, that finished product just looks better. And I don't want to place value on aesthetics that don't need to be there, but I want my project to look as good as it can. And like when, I mentioned earlier, like I would love to design my own valve cover or something like that, where it's like, that it doesn't serve an actual purpose, but it's a piece of jewelry that like you're not going to get one anywhere else. And it's something everybody's going to see and they're going to be like, where did that come from? It's like, I made that, even if it doesn't actually make the build perform any different, right? It's like those types of things. Whether it's making something that does make an actual difference, I would love to make billet control arms for my car or billet uprights for my Ferrari instead of the heavy steel ones that are on there now. There's a great opportunity for subtractive manufacturing that will make an actual performance different. I'll drop unsprung weight like crazy. Could use it there, but then again, to make aesthetic changes, make better parts and pieces, that type of stuff. Be able to make really simple molds to make carbon parts. If I could make little carbon things, you could machine out, a perfect plug and then make a mold, or vice versa. I think there's a lot of opportunities for that. And then kind of, on the horizon, it seems like additive manufacturing, especially for metal. I don't imagine I'm going to have one of those machines anytime soon, but access to those machines is increasing. I have friends that have already had exhaust tips and merge collectors 3D printed out of Inconel, and that's incredible to me. I would love to have some 3D printed, 5-to-1 collector for my Audi or something like that, where it's like, you could technically get it out of billet too, but how much more organic, how much better flowing, how much less limited are you by having one that is through additive manufacturing? So it seems like there's a lot of different ways to incorporate these things. Overall, the quest, again, is just to make the best car that I can and to unlock more doors. Going back to what we were talking about earlier, it's always a quest to learn more and more. I don't want to limit myself because that's self-imposed, right? So the more I can learn, the more tools I can put in my toolbox, the better I can do what I'm passionate about, which is making cool cars.
Yeah. No, I love that. And also inspiring, because what I hear is, it's okay to be a jack of all trades, right? Like, it's okay to know quite a bit about a lot of different things. And sure, maybe you're not the, best machinist on the planet, but can you walk into any shop anywhere and be able to like see yourself through to the end goal? I actually put more weight on that than I do being able to, have one thing that I do it better than anybody else. It seems just so lonely, if I'm honest. Like, I just want to be able to, if I have an idea, if I think it, I want to be able to make it. And that's always been one of those pursuits of mine. And it sounds, I don't know, what you're telling me is kind of resonates with that, right? Like, here's a problem, I'm going to figure out how to solve it. And it's going to be really fulfilling on the way out. So awesome. Well, Mike, thank you so much for having a chat with me. I thought it was amazing. I learned a lot. It's really cool to hear your story. I'd love to give you a couple seconds to, get any of the listeners tuned into what you're doing, or if you have any announcements or anything you want them to check out, let them know what's on your mind.
Absolutely. Yeah, check out the Stanceworks YouTube channel. That's where pretty much all of my effort is at these days. I try to publish once a week episodes that are focused on even the smallest details of building custom cars. It ranges everything from, at the moment, a 31 Ford Model A hot rod to an 80s Ferrari with a Honda engine in it. A little bit of everything for a little bit of everybody. I try to make sure that there's never just this kind of snap of the fingers, oh, hey, this is done. I really want to teach people things. I want it to be entertaining. I want it to be visually enticing. I put a lot of effort into all the content I produce in hopes that, I just want people to enjoy it. It's not meant to be eyeball fodder. It's hopefully something more. So I appreciate you guys recognizing it and wanting to be a part of it. I appreciate you guys having me on. It's been an absolute blast. So thank you guys.
Okay, that was awesome. But don't forget, like, comment, and subscribe to our YouTube channel to stay up to date. Also, if you're ready to try or buy, you can find the link in the description below.